Hey, welcome to Art with Ian. Today we're talking about my approach to painting skin. That's coming up next. Alright, so painting skin. The way I like to paint skin, I start out, I like to create a color palette. Now, you don't have to do this. If you do, it can take some of the pressure off. Just deciding what skin tone you kind of want to go with, how warm, how cool, how dark, how light, all that stuff. And so for this character, for this painting, I wanted a really warm skin tone. And so you can see here kind of my base colors. You can see, if I pull this up, you can see how orange it really is. It's quite orange, if I go into here. And then obviously I did want some pinker one, for the lips and for getting into the cheek and the ear. A couple of those, slightly, you can see if you look here at the actual hue, watch it move up and down. So down here we're in the cooler, you'd think it's warmer, but actually as you get towards red, think of it coming down. If it comes down to here, then it's, think of it going all the way to the top and continuing to come down towards blue. So technically we're actually getting cooler as we go this direction. If you look at this shadow color, it's a little warmer. See how the sliders come up into the orange? And then I also wanted just a very slightly cool or kind of cooler light source coming on the left side of the face. So I picked a cooler light color. And so basically I just kind of set up a palette. I messed with the colors. I looked at a reference to paint off of too, so I kind of looked at what was there, and when I chose my colors, tried to kind of think, get colors that are similar to what's on the subject. So, and then basically when I start painting, so I like to use my chalky render brush, the one that I have a video for creating. I use this for almost everything. It's just such a good brush. But so I lay down a kind of a base. So this is just a quick demo kind of a thing here. So I lay down a base, and then instead of using like an airbrush, I do my initial rendering with this chalky brush. Let's say this is a light spot here. And then I use the color picker, and I mix right off the palette as I start to create more hue, more greater gradations in the colors. I kind of refine based on that, and eventually you might get to a point where there are some areas where you just really want to smooth things back, especially if you're doing like a younger female subject and you want her skin to look just really, really young and almost flawless, even though there's no such thing as flawless skin, but youth does make it feel more so. But anyways, so then at a point I would come in and get an airbrush, which for the airbrush I just used the soft round pressure opacity flow brush, and I would maybe just subtly use it to do some of my deeper gradations, or to soften some of my gradations. But you have to be careful with this, because if you go too far, you might as well just use the airbrush, and it just doesn't look good when you have an overly airbrushed look. And then basically once I kind of get somewhere that I like with the skin, then I come in and I create a layer using the multiply layer mode, which is right here. So under normal, darken, multiply. And I take like a warm, one of my lighter warm skin tones, average skin tones, and I use a stipple splatter brush, which I have one in my essentials pack, which will be available soon, hopefully sooner than later. But there are all kinds of these kinds of brushes you can find around that are just kind of you can kind of see the shape of what it does in my the icon that it shows, the brush tip. So I turn the opacity of this way down to like 14 is fine, 15, 14. And then I get in there and I start to kind of dab in, and especially you want to do this especially where the where your forms turn from dark to light. That's where you see the most texture. And kind of just dab in, and then I come in, I create a new layer. I set it to overlay, which is right here, and I grab like a lighter color, and then I come in and do the same thing, and mostly focusing my energy on, focusing on the area where the form turns. And you can see if you zoom in that it creates a nice kind of pore, emulates kind of like the pores. So if we go back, so basically, to say what I just did there kind of quickly, I start with the base color. I go in and I create my shadows and my lights and when I go into shadow, I get slightly cooler, not too much, but slightly cooler and slightly more saturated in the shadows. And then as I get lighter, I go slightly warmer and slightly less saturated. Then after I've done that, I use a stipple splatter brush to create a bit of a skin texture over the top that helps kind of bring some real life feeling to the skin so that it doesn't feel just, smooth, too smooth. So let's turn these off. If we go back to this, you can see here in the real example, you can see where that stipple splatter brush, right, especially along this form change here where the cheekbone is catching a lot of light. You can see it in the forehead. You can see what that's doing, how it's creating that feeling of kind of like pores, And as you zoom out, it gets less and less obvious, but it's doing, just like real skin, it's not obvious. The pores aren't super obvious from a distance, but it's breaking up the form just enough for you to kind of feel like it's real. And obviously this isn't hyper realistic, but it's realistic enough to kind of feel good. That's like kind of like where I like to live with most of my painting, is like semi-realistic. If you go too realistic, it almost gets like, why not just take a picture? So there's kind of a line you have to draw there, I think. So let's look at a few of my tips for painting skin. So paint a base color and use it as a mask so that everything you can do, or everything that you paint over the top of that, can be clipped to the mask. And I have a video on clipping masks. You'll see a link for it up in the top corner. You can check that out if you want to know more about clipping masks. So once you've got that base color mask down, then you lay down your general hues and values with a textured brush. In my case, I use my chalky textured brush. And this is basically the bulk of the painting. Almost everything is done in this phase. Once you've got all of your hues and values and everything laid down and basically the painting is done, then you can come in and refine your gradations with an airbrush. But again, I reiterate, do not overdo this. Be really careful not to overdo it. Add a skin texture with the stipple splatter brush using multiply and overlay layers. And the reason that you use multiply and overlay is because multiply will add the color you're using to the color that's there instead of painting over it. So it's basically coexisting with what you've already painted instead of just covering it up. And the overlay layer does the same thing. It adds to it but it brightens. So multiply creates kind of the emulation of shadow, and overlay creates the emulation of light. And so as you're creating these, when you're putting your multiply layer down, when you go in and use overlay, kind of think about where you see what your multiply layer has done, and actually think of where your light source is. And when you're stippling the overlay layer, actually try to apply it in such a way that it looks like it's the where the light is catching the pore, as opposed to where you've already created the shadow. That way it's not just overly random splotches on the skin. Try to actually create what a pore really is. In three-dimensional space, the reason you see a pore is because it indents, which basically turns away from the light enough to stop catching light, and once it comes back into the light again, there's an edge, and that edge catches harder light than the rest of your skin, which is a plane facing potentially away from the light. Basically, it creates a plane change that faces the light, and therefore you see the pore. And then after you're done with that, go into your general cleanup and refinement phase, which is basically anything. It's kind of like a last looks. Like once you go in and you kind of go, okay, is everything the way I want it? Maybe zoom in a bit on some areas like the lips, the eyes. Make sure that your reflected light, wherever you're doing reflected light, is feeling correct. Just that kind of general stuff that you might have missed as you're doing the big picture. And that's basically it. Painting skin can be tough at first because there's so many approaches, and there's such a vast difference between like anime cartoon skin and like hyper realistic like old masters oil painted skin, and kind of trying to find where you want to live between those extremes can make it really difficult to kind of land anywhere. It can, one day you might be trying to do one thing, and another day you might be trying to do another thing. And I think that getting beyond the cartoon skin enough to like moving towards the more realistic skin enough to understand or improve your rendering skills is really important. Even if you end up going back, and if you're super into anime or other cartoon type of art, even if you end up going back to that, you'll go back to that with such a greater knowledge of what you could do with your work, instead of living somewhere with where you've always got less knowledge because you never push yourself to the next step. Yeah, I think that if you went and looked up the people who create a lot of this kind of artwork, like anime artwork and that kind of stuff, you'd find that they've gone way beyond that level in their own artistic endeavors. It's just the stylistic choice that they've made for a career, or those kinds of things. So I would highly consider taking your rendering skills, or your learning to render to a higher standard when you try to learning your skin, instead of just a base color, a shadow, and maybe a hot spot somewhere, which can be great. It's just you might not learn as much about skin and how it behaves if you do that. So I hope you got something from this video. I'd love to see any of your guys' paintings that you've done. Comment in the video, like and subscribe as always. Follow me on Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, share it with your friends, ring the bell for notifications of future videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.